Good morning, thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I think this is a very interesting topic. I personally am a great fan of Vernor Vinge. I think I've read everything he's published, so I'll be making some Vernor Vinge references throughout the morning. I hope other people have read at least some of his work, and I expect some of you have read a lot of his work. So we have what I've described as a societal technology paradox, and this is nothing new. I would summarise that as saying something is rotten in the state of technology. So we have triumphed over nature. You are unlikely to be eaten by a lion, a bear, a shark, or a crocodile. Those aren't the threats we see today. But don't be so confident about a virus. We have achieved safe drinking water. We've known how to provide safe drinking water for over 100 years now. But billions of people in the world today don't have safe drinking water. The level of technology publishing and discoveries has never been higher. You read figures on how many mountains of how many thousands of journals, how many millions of research articles are being published. And yet the rate of discovery has been declining per head of population has been declining for the last century. We are discovering less per person now than we did 100 years ago. And I would summarise that as saying society isn't getting the technology that it requires. So, in terms of getting more from technology, the history of the Earth has several cases of civilizations which collapsed. Vernor Vinge, in his work on singularity, doesn't suggest that we're going to move to singularity in a nice steady pace, either in terms of the development of technology discoveries or in terms of the implementation of those technologies. What I want to look at today is some of the contradictory aspects of technological advances. Now, I'm not picking up that question of unexpected consequences, which is a concept that was developed about 150 years ago and which is now fairly widely understood. But at the factors that can stop technology from achieving improvements to society, particularly the improvements that we as technologists would expect. Actually, at that point, I might ask, how many people here would consider themselves technologists, that is engineers or people who work with IT or stuff like that? Right. Okay. Actually, how many people, are there any other IEEE members here, just out of interest? I'm also not talking about the question of technology uptake, and technology uptake is a widely researched field. Basically, every commercial organisation that's promoting technology, every government department that's attempting to achieve things using technology will be paying attention to the question of technology uptake, talking about product life cycles, usability, other issues. What I'm talking about is the failure of technology, failure of socially beneficial technology. And I'm basing what I'm speaking about today on many fields, including legal, regulatory, political, philosophical, sociological, usage, psychological, technical, economic, commercial, and marketing. In this presentation, and this is a subset of a wider piece of research I've done, I've put together a list of approximately 105 different frameworks, different theories on why technology might fail. And today I'm going to be speaking about 7 of these. I'd like to say a little bit about the work of Vernor Vinge here. Firstly, I might just explain, I have broken the cardinal rule of PowerPoint here, which is no more than 6 lines on a page and nothing under 36 points. And I've done that deliberately. And as you go along, you'll see it actually gets worse. I get more and more. In fact, I think I get twice as much information as this on some of my pages. I don't have charts which could distract you. I have just lots and lots of text. And the reason I'm doing this in this particular presentation is because as soon as you get into the question of why didn't the technology succeed or why doesn't the technology work, you very quickly get into accusations of conspiracy. So you could say, well, this great technology didn't succeed because, and then it could be a pharmaceutical company, a particular high court judge, something or other, a security organisation, a something or other, knew about this and suppressed it. Now, I'm not going to comment on conspiracy theories. I think they have a place, but I'm not interested in venturing into that area. So all of the stuff I'm providing here, I've actually gone back to fairly simple, basic source material so that people can test what I'm saying, but I'm not actually saying it on the basis of contested sources. So I've put in a fair bit of detail so people can pick back through it themselves. So just to pick out 3 examples from Vernor Vinge. Can technology develop in the face of total government control? Now, if you read Peace War, how many people here have read Peace War? Okay, the rest of you should read it. The basic idea of peace war is that you have a government which fully controls, through their monopoly of a single technology, fully controls every aspect of society. And it's the development of the novel is the development of a grassroots organisation to overcome that government control. And through that full government control, they have frozen social development in every way. Now, Vinge returns to this in his latest book, Rainbow's End, which was published in 2007, taking up the idea that was raised in the 1990s that people might remember, which was the idea that you have a backdoor in all hardware. So Intel and AMD and every other organisation under government instruction should insert a backdoor that allows the government to download any information off any computer that's running on one of those processors. Now, I don't know if people remember that was a 1990s discussion. There's a little bit of a problem with that, which is that as soon as the United States does that, every other country in the world is going to develop their own processors, especially China, and China has the resources to do it, and effectively the US would destroy its CPU industry. Anyway, it's discussed in a lot of detail with quite a few nuances. In Rainbow's End. He calls it the secure hardware environment, or SHE, which is a sort of nice Vingism. And that's I have a strongly held view on that, which is if you have full government control of technology, that society grinds to a halt. And that's my personal view, but I'm not speaking about that. The second point here, the second question that he raises, does war spending advance or hinder positive technological progress? So if we're talking about it's all in the context of moving towards a singularity. If we have full government control of all IT, we will not move in. We're not moving forward at all. Then other processes happen in society. Now people often point to war spending as a beneficial thing, and Vernor Vinge has presented a couple of different views on this. In Deepness in the Sky, he actually describes a planet where technology is moving very, very quickly under the impetus of an arms race. In another book, in a short story called Just Peace, an earlier writing in 1971, he describes a situation where a world is threatened by cataclysmic tectonic disaster. And they have 140 years, and the two main forces in this world are fighting with each other. And in that he argues very strongly that if they keep fighting with each other, then in 140 years' time, when that disaster comes, humanity will be wiped out on that planet. It's a very interesting, I find that story a very interesting metaphor for climate change, the question of how we address climate change. Yeah. Do we depend on global cooperation to solve very big questions? The third question that he deals with is, isn't death a necessary part of societal renewal? And I find this one very interesting. And there are I have read many science fiction books and short stories on this question. And almost universally, they present the position that if you have people living for hundreds of years or thousands of years, social progress stops. So in terms of, I'm not saying that to disturb anybody here, but I know a lot of the discussion around singularity involves discussion about how we can extend human life. And I'd just like to throw out there the idea that without death, we will never reach singularity. So the longer we extend people's lives, the greater the weight of the past will hang over as a hand on the future. To pick up, Vinge picks this up specifically at a family level in Rainbow's End, where the extension of life within a particular family brings back all that hell and horror that family suffered from this particular bastard who was the leader of the family for a long time. And as he goes from the edge of death through to fully functioning again, you could sort of see the family degenerating into going back, falling back, and not escaping into the future in the way that the person said was expected to lead. Thomas Kuhn's idea of paradigm shift, and today a paradigm shift is in anything that happens, paradigm shifts happen in the hour or something like that. If you go and read Thomas Kuhn's original work, what he describes is, or what he says is, when a new scientific discovery happens, the weight of evidence from that scientific discovery does not change people's view. And he makes this very clear. He says, what changes people's view is the people who believe in the old theories they're never convinced by facts. They have to die. They have to leave the profession and eventually die, and then you get all these people with the old ideas who are dead, and then the people with the new ideas who are supported by science and scientific fact and evidence can actually carry forward those new ideas into the future. And that's when you think of the way people usually use the word paradigm shift, which means fashion change. It's sort of become to mean fashion change. That's a little bit of we've taken a bit of a different view there. Now, what I want to do is a series of counterpositions. Firstly, I want to talk about how engineers see themselves, see ourselves, and then I want to talk about some of the experiences we've had with technology. So, if there's anybody here who considers themselves a technologist, who strongly agrees with anything I say that engineers view, please jump in. I'm happy to hear. If you're not a technologist or engineer and you disagree with those views, just trust me, this is what we think about ourselves. Okay. So, we're problem solvers. That is our raison d'etre. We do the hard subjects at university. We have 40 hours contact every week. We don't have 16 hours. You know, the philosopher, 16 hours contact. And then we just go get drunk in the other time, so we don't have time to think about those things. We understand the stuff that other people can't, partly because we put it all in our own terms, and we get new terms for everything all the time. Our friends and sometimes our relatives tell us how smart we are. Our relatives are more likely to be honest and tell us that we're stupid at certain points.
I'll make a quick remark. When I was an undergrad, I was at Queen's College in College Crescent. The non-engineers had a saying about the engineers. About the particular engineer. All my life I wanted to be an engineer, and now I are one.
Yeah, few of those. So let's look at my first example, the $300 million moon climate orbiter that crashed into Mars in 1999. And here's my crowded slide. Okay. Now, this is rocket science. This is literally rocket science. You look at this stuff. Okay, what have we got? I'll just pick a couple of these. Okay, so we have, let's look at the periaps altitude and the preferred periaps altitude, which is the distance that it can travel from the planet before it actually hits the very thin atmosphere and burns up. Okay, so we've got, the ideal is 210 kilometres. During the investigation they noticed it was actually down to 150 to 170 kilometres. The survivable distance is 80 kilometres. They did lots of very fancy braking. They looked at things in great detail. They calculated the difference between what they were expecting and what they were seeing. They had many challenges which they dealt with as only engineers could do. And here you're talking about people controlling a device which is many millions of kilometres away from them. So it's an engineering marvel, absolute engineering marvel. Okay. Just like you to focus on this, on the line in red. The impulse bit data contained in the AMD file was delivered in pounds per second instead of the specified and expected units of newtons per second. Right? $300 million, 190 days to get the thing there. And the programmers, some of the programmers were programming in imperial measurements and some of them were programming in metric, and nobody noticed. Right? So that was a lot of very smart engineers were involved in that total experience. Okay, now engineers are admired. Once again, I'm talking to the engineers here, not engineers. We are well paid compared to the people we work with. Not compared to CEOs, of course, but we are we're paid a lot more than some of the other people who do very socially important jobs, such as teachers. In the lists of trusted professions, we rank amongst teachers, doctors, nurses, so we are highly respected. We're knocked down the bottom with politicians, journalists and used car salespeople. Our opinions are expert and are sought at every turn. So it's almost when someone talks about an expert witness in a court case, it's as likely to be an engineer as anybody else. We are experts. We're not just SME, we're subject matter experts, we are experts. And here I just want to pick out a problem, which is that social prejudices can destroy the greatest talent. So in one way we're admired, but if we're not doing something that's fully admirable, or which is considered fully admirable according to certain rules in society at that time, then we can suffer dreadfully. And the example I'd like to give here is talk about vilification. And the example I'd like to talk about is Alan Turing. Now, Alan Turing's a very famous, obviously a very famous person. He's there's the Turing Award, which is sort of the computer equivalent of the Nobel Prize. There's the Turing Test, which is Vernor Vinge wrote about this in, I think it was True Names and Other Dangers. So people will remember that. So are people familiar with the Turing Test? I guess most people are. Yeah. So that was a nice discussion of can the computer fool the individual, and it was quite an ambiguous piece. It was never quite, you were never quite clear in that story exactly what was happening, but on balance, you realised that finally you had a computer that could pass that test. Now, Alan Turing, obviously to computer scientists, is an extremely important person, but within wider society is also immensely respected. So what I've got a quote from here is from Gordon Brown, UK Prime Minister, that he made, in fact, 1 year ago on Friday. And so just to read out a couple of bits. Earlier this year I stood with President Tchaikovsky debating to honour the service and sacrifice of heroes who stormed the beaches of Normandy 65 years ago. I'm both pleased and proud that thanks to a coalition of computer scientists, historians, LGBT activists, we have this year a chance to mark and celebrate another contribution to Britain's fight against the darkness of dictatorship, the codebreaker Alan Turing. He goes on to refer to, I think in very moving terms, I don't have a lot of time for politicians, but some of the apologies that we've seen coming out in the last few years are very heartfelt. And he refers to his role during the Second World War in code breaking. Then in 1952 he was convicted of gross indecency and in fact tried for being gay. His sentence, he was faced with a miserable choice of this or of prison, was chemical castration by a series of injections. He took his own life 2 years later. So when you talk about, and this is really serious stuff, and this is one of the heroes of all technologists in the world, there are things that can go wrong. We believe we live in a civilized society. There are things that can go really, really badly wrong that prevent scientists and engineers from doing their best. And even further than that, you can say, you'd have to look around and say, Do you in your heart believe that everybody in the world today who has the capacity to be a great scientist or engineer is achieving that and making the contribution they put to society? And I'd be surprised if anybody here thinks we're, I'd say maybe we're at about 10% or 20%, given all the things that can go wrong in the world and all the opportunities that there could be and all the things that can go wrong. Sorry, just his last point. We're sorry you deserve some. Engineers are rational. Okay. Our work is based on the laws of science. It is. It is. We approach our problem-solving challenges in a structured way.
The random forces.
Not a sensible way, a structured way. We weigh up the evidence when developing a technological solution. And yet some of our best efforts may be thwarted by the most irrational arguments. Now here I'm not talking about a failure of what engineers do. I'm talking about a failure of what engineers expect. Because engineers and technologists by and large expect the rest of the world to be fairly like them and to use the same sort of arguments and to argue fair and not to argue dirty and to be rational and to be sensible and not to say things like, when we need to recycle water in Toowoomba, not to say things like, do you want to be drinking someone else's whatever. We don't expect people to use those arguments because we know that it's all safe and it's all got to be done and it's absolutely essential. So just to give an example here about the use of irrational arguments. Now this is from Jack Valenti, who was at the time, in 1982, president of the Motion Picture Association of America. Now this guy is very, very famous in media circles. He was the head of radio back in the days of radio before television came along. And then he moved into being the main spokesperson for television. For motion pictures and a major representative for television. Now, just to quote a little bit out of this, and as you can see, I'm going back to the sources. I'm not saying this guy said such and such. I'm actually putting it in his words so you can see I'm not unfairly paraphrasing. And he says, and he's talking. This is talking about the VCR. Now, people today may not even know what a VCR is. So he says, now this is where the problem is. You take a high risk, which means we must go by the aftermarkets to recoup our investments. So he's saying you can't, if there's a VCR, it's going to destroy the film industry. If those aftermarkets are decimated, shrunken, collapsed because of what I'm going to be explaining to you in a minute, because of the fact that the VCR is stripping those things clean, those markets clean of all our potential profit. Are you going to be you are going to have devastation in this marketplace. We are going to bleed and hemorrhage unless this Congress does such and such. The total, talking about the country whose total future depends on its protection from the savagery and the ravages of this machine, the VCR. And then just to highlight the final thing. I say to you that the VCR is to the American film producer and the American public as the Boston Strangler is to a woman home alone. Now, just imagine you were developing a VCR. Just imagine you were working out how to market it, your target audience and stuff like that. Is this the sort of thing you'd expect to be up against? As an engineer, as a technologist, not a chance. We're just clueless in this space.
Well, I have to say that is a marvellous example of English literature, very vivid imagery. So it would actually be a persuasive argument to politicians in all likelihood.
That's right. Politicians and in other cases the general public will listen to things and will completely miss the technical points, the opportunity, the importance. It'll just be completely lost in a few grabs like this. Now, engineers are self-sacrificing, and I'm not saying this in a facetious way. in any sense. We consider that we design things that work well. We pride ourselves on things that we design working well. We solve problems that benefit people, whether it's benefiting people directly, such as providing them with services, or indirectly, such as providing them with high-quality entertainment or other things like that. In general, if money is your primary motivator, you won't choose engineering as a course at university. You're more likely to choose if you're good at maths and you really want to make a lot of money, you're more likely to pick something on the accounting, economic side that will do you well in the financial services industry. Yet, ironically, time after time, courts find that the projects that we have delivered breach monopoly laws and reflect other antisocial behaviour. So we go in there with the best motives. We go in there with the limited understanding of ethics, and I say limited because until recently it wasn't in the engineering curriculum. We go in there with a self-sacrificing view, and we end up working for companies which then can do some very antisocial things. And so my fourth area is greed. And for an example there, I'm selecting a ruling against Microsoft by US District Judge Thomas Jackson in 1999. Now, people who are familiar, everybody I think here would be familiar with the arguments with the debates about whether or not Microsoft is in general a great innovator or place limits on innovation. I'm not particularly interested in getting into that field. What I want to do is show that courts, whose job it is to consider whether companies have breached particular laws, in this case antitrust laws, have breached those. And so in this case, in the view of this particular judge, he has reviewed a massive amount of evidence and come up with a particular finding. And just to highlight a few points out of this. So he says the actions that Microsoft took against Navigator hobbled the form of innovation that had shown the potential to depress the application's barrier to entry sufficiently to enable other firms to compete. This idea about barriers to entry is a very important economic, commercial point. People will be familiar with the concept of competitive advantage. You may not know the work done by Michael Porter, but competitive advantage is a term that was coined by Michael Porter. And the point he makes is that for a company to invest in an area, it's not enough to be able to make a profit. You actually need to be able to sustain that profit. If you can't sustain that profit, if you spend a year developing something, go to market, you sell a lot on the first week, and then everybody else copies you, and in the second week you sell none, then you haven't achieved competitive advantage. So that's what competitive advantage is. Some people tend to think technology provides competitive advantage, but Michael Porter has explicitly stated that's not true. In his words, if one company can buy a computerized lathe from Germany, any other company can buy the same computerized lathe. It doesn't give one company a competitive advantage over another company. So we're looking at hobbling, and this is why. This is one of the things behind the idea that trusts are bad, because trusts prevent innovation. And this is obviously a very contested idea within the US legal system. So while the Democrats were in office, Microsoft was losing its court cases. As soon as the Republicans got in, they started winning their court cases. So this isn't some sort of broad objective situation, but within the late 1990s there was a fair bit of focus on this, and also the European Union also focused on this as well. Later on he says Microsoft has demonstrated that it will use its prodigious market power and immense profits to harm any firm that insists on pursuing initiatives that could intensify competition against one of Microsoft's core products. You might say, so what? Well, the so what is that's illegal. And then at the end, some innovations that would truly benefit consumers never occurred for the sole reason that they do not coincide with Microsoft's self-interest. So while you might say, yes, that's all okay, it's their right to make money, in US law it's not. That's anti-competitive behaviour and it's illegal. But that's an example of the sort of situation, but you didn't have the engineers sitting in Microsoft thinking, thinking about these questions. They were thinking, how can I overcome the extreme shortage we've got in our security in our product? Or they were thinking about, how can I add some nice new, more likely to think about how can I add some nice new great features for this particular application. They weren't thinking about, how can I help Microsoft enforce its control over the market and make a monopolist profit. The next area, engineers get it right. You can laugh at this, yes. So our reason for existing is to solve problems. So if we're not solving problems, we're not. That's what we do. So of course we get it right. That's what we do. And even if it's never existed before, if a new problem emerges, we can find a solution because we're really good at that. We know every day millions of people depend on engineer solutions for their safety and well-being. Everybody who drives a car, everybody who eats food that's been prepared according to certain safety standards, everybody who uses a piece of machinery that doesn't hurt them is in some way benefiting from what engineers have provided to them. However, engineering is among the least reflective of the professions. We virtually never consider that we could be part of the problem. So when we're looking at all these, so we have a problem comes along. Okay, what do we do about it? Okay, this and this, and we get this and this, and the problem is this. We never think, okay, I can see a lot of engineers have done tremendous damage in these particular circumstances, and as Einstein said, the thinking that got us into current problems isn't going to be sufficient to get us out of these problems. So now in this case, unfortunately in this case I was not able to find, I wanted to use the example of I have used the example of the Hydroelectric Commission in Tasmania. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a single example of anybody with an engineering background who was involved in that, in any of the activities of the Hydroelectric Commission of Tasmania has actually thought about it and realised they did wrong and put pen to paper. If someone is aware of a case like that, I'd be very interested. What I've used instead is some work by an engineer from the University of, from Australia National University, which was part of the submission to Parliament in the late 90s. So this was and I've called this one Hubris, and this is the idea that you are so confident in your position, your role, your rights and what you're doing that you completely ignore any criticism. So to look at the last paragraph there, for those who aren't aware, we had this organisation in Tasmania. Its job was to build dams to produce hydroelectricity. Now, I don't know if people have read science fiction books that have long, detailed discussions about what happens when you program a person or a computer with a particular instruction. So you can give a very, very simple instruction, and that instruction, which appears to be absolutely straightforward, can then cause crazy, unexpected results immediately or generations later. Does everyone here know the work of C.J. Cherry? Right. So SIT is probably the best example of this. So her writing, and particularly the SIT trilogy, is very, very thorough understanding of what happens when you program a particular thing with a particular instruction. Anyway, in this case, the Hydroelectric Commission was programmed with the instruction build dams to produce hydroelectricity. It wasn't work out how much electricity is needed and then meet that requirement in an intelligent way. It wasn't anything as complicated as that. It was build dams. So they started building dams in the 1930s, and they kept on building dams in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. By the 1970s, they were building. When they flooded Lake Pedder, they were doing untold. They were starting to create untold destruction to some of the world's finest biodiversity areas for that type of climate, and the green movement we see in Australia is really an offshoot or an outgrowth of the result of people saying, hey, if you just keep on damming every river in sight and producing this electricity which nobody needs, when are you going to stop? So it was really a machine out of control. So ironically, this particular paper argues that if they hadn't been stopped, so the government said you're not allowed to build any more dams and gave them lots of several $100 million compensation. This paper actually argues that they were going deeper and deeper in debt. So it wasn't just that they were madly building dams, it was that they completely lost any connection with commercial reality, let alone environmental reality. So his conclusion, this was an engineer at ANU's conclusion, was that the Commonwealth saved the HEC from financial disaster by blocking construction of this final dam. Rather than receiving further compensation, they should be grateful for the Commonwealth for saving it from its own folly. Examples in this case, a non-engineer can point to many, many examples. It's hard for an engineer to point to many examples of where we've done wrong. I don't mean, of course, we've built a bridge that failed or something like that, but a bigger picture where we've gone in with we've jumped in with a technology solution that really wasn't the right solution at the time. And the cost here is that the technology solutions which could have been providing better electricity production to Tasmania weren't followed, because, or they were delayed for decades, because all the money was being sucked into this machine to build dams. The last couple, this one, engineers share knowledge. So IEEE, which I'm a member of, and which I'm speaking on behalf of today, although these views are the specific views of mine, has 400,000 members with hundreds of separate professional publications. You look up our publications, we have a publication on everything, and they're very, very high quality, very good stuff. You could not live a few hours without your life in some way being impacted by an IEEE standard. Whether it's the traffic lights or the local area network you connect to, all the other things. On principle, IEEE will not exclude any engineer from any country in the world from reading or publishing in its journals. So where the United States says we will not have any dealings with, and it lists a number of countries, IEEE, although it's centred in the United States, has as part of its mission that it will deal with all those countries, and it's fairly regularly in court demanding the right to have professional involvement from every country, from engineers in every country of the world. Despite the habit of engineers sharing knowledge and building on the knowledge that others have developed, there are major discoveries hidden because of their actual or imagined value as national security secrets. Now, this is a space where you can suddenly jump into a very strange place. So I know somebody told me that a major corporation has a formula that allows you to turn water into petrol, into gas. Someone invented this formula, and then the company bought it and hid it. Okay, so somebody says that, I think, okay, I've got no basis on which to judge. It's like the existence of God, I've got no basis on which to judge that. And then people will, but it is the case that national security is used, just as limited bandwidth is used as a basis for limiting the number of organisations that have access to radio or television licences. National security is used to limit access to specific technology. Now, the example I'm using here is spread spectrum. Now, people are familiar with the concept of spread spectrum? I see a few nods and a few shakes. Okay. Spread spectrum is this absolutely fantastic. This is where I get really excited about being an engineer, because the stuff that you think, being an engineer rather than a scientist actually, science can prove stuff and engineers can then get around it in other ways. So engineers can't break the laws of physics, but engineers can think of ways to address the shortcomings or the limitations that the laws of physics impose on them. There's an absolute rule when you're broadcasting something, when you're broadcasting a signal, wherever you're broadcasting, there's going to be noise. There's going to be what's called noise, which gets in the way of your signal being received. Now, the rule is the broadcast that you send out has to be bigger than the noise, because otherwise it just gets hidden in the noise. Spread spectrum breaks that. Spread spectrum says no. You can send out a noise signal, and if you think of it as a voltage, you think of it as a voltage going along like that, and you've got a signal going along like that. You think, how on earth could anyone pick a signal that's lower than the voltage level? That doesn't sound possible. And the answer is, the other rule about broadcasting is you broadcast louder than the noise, and you broadcast on as narrow a bandwidth as possible so that you can fit the maximum number of broadcasts in to a fixed bandwidth. Spread spectrum says, forget all that. We'll use the whole bandwidth. We'll use a massive amount of bandwidth. And we'll broadcast only with the same power that the other broadcasters use. And we'll broadcast lower than the noise threshold. And if you know where to look, you'll find it. And that's what spread spectrum is. Absolutely, I haven't done it justice, but if you're interested, you can look it up on the Wikipedia page on spread spectrum. It's very good. Now, spread spectrum modulation, it's wideband modulation, originally developed for military applications. Now here I'm quoting from the Federal Communications Commission, an FCC report. This is non-controversial, this is absolutely standard, but I still wanted to say, okay, this is a 1980 report written for the FCC in the US. So, what actually happened there? What actually happened? So we had ideas of Tesla and some other early developers of the early last century developed the concept that would later become the idea of spectrum. In 1941, a couple of people, Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil. Now, George Antheil was a music hacker, so he took musical instruments and hacked with them, in the same way as a software hacker might hack with a piece of code. And he was figuring, if I had a pianola playing 88 notes per, 88 levels. He had 88 levels in his representing piano keys in his pianola products. And he said, we would be able to, and the person who understands, the challenge was how to have underwater submarine communication that couldn't be blocked by the opposition. Hedy Lamarr had been married to an Austrian industrialist who was providing weapons to the German military machine in the Second World War. In the 1930s, she left for America. George Antheil was a pianist, and he similarly migrated from Europe. Hedy Lamarr is much better known as a famous Hollywood actor. And they filed a patent called Secret Communication, 10th of June 1941, which described frequency hopping, which is a type of spread spectrum. Now, this was then put under the cloud of military secrecy and she was a patriot. She was an anti-Nazi patriot. She really wanted to contribute. So she didn't particularly care that they said, okay, we're going to use this for secret military business. They didn't actually do very much with it at all. They held on to it. There were some radios based on frequency hopping used during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, but it wasn't a widely developed technology. It was only in the late 70s. In the 1970s, it was removed from the list of secret technologies. In the late 70s, some work was done on it. As you can see, in 1980, the FCC started looking at making it legal rather than illegal, which it had been. And today, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, second generation mobile telephony, third generation mobile telephony is all based on spread spectrum. So, if we hadn't sort of delayed, and I'm not saying Hedy Lamarr's patent is what we now use in our mobile phones, but that was a key thing, and that was the cutting edge of it in 1940. If we hadn't delayed between 1940 and 1970, 75, 80 in the development of spread spectrum, it also required computerization and miniaturization, a whole bunch of other things. But we just delayed that for 30, 40 years for absolutely no benefit at all. And that's an example that I'm very interested in. That example. It's a great example of women in engineering. It's a great example of a whole lot of things. And it's very, as I say, it's very well presented in the Wikipedia entry now. And that's a non-controversial example where someone won't say, oh no, the knowledge you didn't hide that secret. Engineers and intellectual freedom. The work of engineers today is built on the shoulders of scientific and engineering discoveries of the past. An engineering practice without a continuous flow of new discoveries is inconceivable. Every year there are many thousands of conferences facilitating that research. And sometimes, very rarely, a researcher who goes to a conference and presents a paper is then put in charge. Very rarely. And that obviously has a chilling effect on innovation. Now, who was this person who was jailed? Okay, now we're talking about a guy called Dmitry Skulyarov, a Russian researcher who'd done work on Adobe, the security around the Adobe eBook. Now, the first part of this is actually the grand jury indictment against him. So that's and this is based on a complaint that was raised by Adobe, although they later withdrew their involvement in it because they were getting a lot of flack. So on or about dates unknown, but beginning no later than June 20, 2001, Elcom and Skulyarov and other persons knowingly and intentionally conspire for purposes of commercial advantage, willfully offer to the public, circumventing protection afforded by technological measures that effectively protected a right of copyright, blah, blah, blah. So this was the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that he was charged under. And the DMCA says that you can't notify anybody of any means of breaking copyright. So I don't know whether people remember the CD, I think it was a CD protection system that came out a few years ago, where you couldn't play a CD on your computer, you could only play it on your... Okay, now, to crack that, to break, and it was quite sophisticated. It wasn't very sophisticated, but it was quite sophisticated code. In order to break that code, in order to be able to play it on your computer, what you had to do was, and if I was in the US, I could crack it with all that. You had to get a felt pen, and imagine that's my CD. You had to draw a black line around the edge of the CD. Okay. So you've just broken the code. However, that code is there for an important commercial reason, and therefore anyone who investigates how to break that code is obviously attempting to make money out of stealing somebody else's intellectual property. Now the alternate view is, what idiot put together a security system that you could break with a top pen? And the reason you can, for the technologists, the reason it breaks is because when you stick that CD, what you've done is you've just corrupted all the information that the computer uses before it starts playing the CD. So the computer tries to play the CD. It says, I can't make any sense of these instructions. Okay, what comes next? Oh, some music. Oh, okay, I'll play some music. So that's why it works. I love engineering. So they arrest this guy. So he goes to a conference. They arrest this guy under this DMCA. He's jailed from 16th of July until the 6th of August. He's not allowed to leave the US until the 13th of December of the same year. So he's stuck in the US for several months. He's got a family and young child in Moscow. A year later, he goes to trial and he's found innocent. That's the delight. This whole thing fell to pieces. So this whole attempt to, this whole point about you go to a conference and you arrest a guy who's given a paper, that is absolutely disgraceful. But it does happen. It doesn't happen very often, and after this case, it's less likely to happen. But that, in terms of the things that can stop good technologies from being successful. And the reason I'm giving US examples are they're well documented. I'm not saying the US by any means is the worst offender in this space. There would be countries around the world without anything like the safety, or with anything like the legal safeties and the activist community that the US has, who could potentially be in a far worse situation, or who are in a far worse situation. But the US is very
well documented.
These cases in the US are very well documented. Now, as I said, I've developed a list of 105 of these different items. So that was 7 of them. There are many more, which and I've referenced this list on the other thing. So if people have any questions about any of those, by and large, some of them are quite. Some of them are very high level and some of them are very detailed. Some of them are as simple as not fit for purpose, and others are as complex as.
Do you think it is question time now?
Sorry.
Is the question time now?
Are you're well?
No, sure. Please remain short comment until the question is asked. Sure.
Oh, okay. Look, I'll.
Don't answer. Just continue.
No, because if people have a question, I don't want them to forget it.
Okay.
So,
We'll wait.
if you can remember your question, yeah. I'm just about on the last couple of slides. So it goes from as simple as not fit for purpose through to severe philosophical concerns. So you try to do stem cell research in the United States, and you have a very, very big structure standing in the way of you doing some of that research. And that is not for any reason other than philosophical frameworks, the philosophical frameworks of people in certain positions. So anyway, that's a long list there. So, in conclusion, there are many different reasons and theories of blockers to the adoption of socially beneficial technology. I've presented a small subset of these. Taken as a whole, these reasons account for many tragedies in the world today. So although you look at some of them and you think, okay, that's a bit extreme, okay, well, it was red spectrum was held, but there couldn't be all that many others, and then there's this, some of the other cases, Slidaroff was arrested, but how often do you hear of that happening since the Spanish Inquisition? So you might look at them individually and think, well, that doesn't cover very many cases. I would assert that today the lack of clean drinking water in the world, which causes millions of childhood deaths, is a reflection of the inability to get the necessary technology to the right people at the right time. For many, many reasons. And this is why I'm saying, this is where the list of 105 reasons comes from. And I'm not trying to say X is at fault or Y is at fault. I'm saying this is the world we live in. We live in a world where we have great technologies that could solve lots of our current problems, and potential technologies that could solve many of the other problems, and they're just not getting out there, or many of them aren't getting out there. And so what I would say for that is, for engineers who want to promote socially beneficial technology, and I'm not saying every engineer should, but for engineers who do want to promote socially beneficial technology, is their responsibility to seek the expertise we need to overcome these barriers. So we have a responsibility to think about, as we're developing our great new low carbon building material, we have a responsibility as engineers not just to think, okay, this is how we can develop it, but we've got to think, who do we need to align ourselves with to solve the fact that the finance company, that the insurance companies aren't going to insure us building this stuff, that the local planning authorities aren't going to accept it because it's not in their list, that the building standards codes won't allow anybody to sign off on this work. We have responsibilities to think about those other things, because otherwise we might be doing a lot of what we think is good work, but essentially it's going to go for nothing. And just to finish on a reference to the social implications of technology, we've been going in Australia for 5 years. We have 130 or so members in Australia across the country. A couple of the technical meetings we've organised, we had Kevin Warwick from Reading University speaking on the cyborg experiments in March or April this year. The Telstra CTO, Dr. Hugh Bradlow, gave a talk at the 35 Collins Street in the Technology Centre on climate change response. We had an IEEE Board of Directors member, Mark Montrose, speaking last Tuesday on engineering in the 21st century. Some of the talks we've got coming up in the next few months. In Sydney, we've got we're co-sponsored with the Cyber Law Centre at the University of New South Wales on internet censorship with a professor from Macquarie University also speaking on packet inspection. We have in November Anne Stewart, the CIO at GEMA, the Australian Government CIO, head of GEMA, is going to be talking at a Canberra forum, a technical meeting. We've got a bit of a debate on whether Wikipedia achieves its goals, happening in late October in Melbourne, and in Perth we've got a forum on 3D, the effects of 3D on television watching, particularly amongst children. That's in early October. If you're interested in being on our mailing list and getting notification, I know this list was circulated yesterday. If you're interested in being notified about any of these activities that are coming up, please put your name on. Please write your name on this list, which will just pass around. And there's also our website there that you can look at. So, questions? Yes?
Out of your 105 reasons, which is the most pernicious and easily preventable, and how can you prevent it in the most practical way possible? Oh, in your opinion.
Yeah. I personally think, this wasn't one of the ones I dealt with, I personally think the most pernicious one is in the way the intellectual property laws are structured. So the fact that you could have a technology that's known, that's out there, that could be working, and a lawyer will tell somebody that an AIDS victim in South Africa cannot use a medicine because they have a legal barrier to these medicines being produced so they can be distributed to the...
Is it about all patents or just software patents?
No, all intellectual property, not software. All intellectual. As a group, I think the intellectual property ones are the most easily, not necessarily easily solvable, but they're the most blatantly unnecessary.
Firstly, I am an accountant and we are pretty smart people too. But going back to actually what you said right in the beginning, you were talking about longevity and ways to avoiding or putting off debt as being a major problem for the coming of a singularity. Let me be the devil's advocate and say maybe that's a good idea. I don't particularly, it terrifies me, the singularity. Things like architects is something which I would much rather never happen. So maybe we should promote longevity as a way of not coming to these places.
There are utopian and dystopian views of the singularity. Obviously, well, not obviously, I would say the most clearly articulated dystopian view of the singularity is the Terminator is in the third of the Terminator movies, where they just reach a point. At a certain point, everything, and this is very, very close to the way singularity is often presented. At a certain point, things just, a number of connections have reached a tipping point, and then it happens in a matter of hours. So there are definitely dystopian views. The question of age, I would suggest you read some of the science fiction discussions of what are the impacts of people living hundreds of years. Rainbow's End is potentially a good starting point for an audience like this.
I think one of the real problems you see is that engineering decisions are made in a prevailing context and a prevailing wisdom. I just mentioned two examples that have totally turned on their head because of what we now know and didn't know at the time they were made. Melbourne is kind of unique amongst English-speaking cities in that we kept our trams. Everywhere else there was this complete lie that you could get more traffic, more people moving in cars than you could get in trams. So wrong it doesn't matter. We fortunately kept ours, having still developed enough. The other one in the same kind of period, Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works were a great engineering organisation, but they had a belief that our creek and river system existed to get rid of water out of the environment, not to keep it in the environment. So we finished up putting concrete channels where we had natural creeks, and that again is something that cost the reversing that is staggering. Now, these were well-intentioned decisions, except maybe in the case of Transverse Road made from a very biased industry, after people in LA and places like that, they'll tell you how big a disaster it's been. And here it's not much better, but it is a bit better because one person put it in. So I think the judgment of engineers needs to sometimes be written, and this is where I've run into problems with just you wanting, short lifespans. I mean, basically you don't learn these things without long lifespans. You don't actually see the context. There's a lot of things that, having been there in the 50s, I can see today that people who are didn't see can only remember, the 90s with effort. Just don't see about the world.
I'm not arguing for short lifespans. I'm saying it's definitely. I'm not arguing for and I'm not arguing against. I'm saying it's a well-discussed area in the field of science fiction, and it's worth reading some of these. Some of the people who describe the problem. I think partly the problem is that if you take a world, was summarised very well by somebody who's, I'm not sure where it came from, but they said we've developed all of these, we've made so much technical progress in the last 50 years, and basically we've made, in terms of the ethics of, say, politicians, or ethics in social space, we have made no progress. There is no evidence that the ethics of politicians today is better than the ethics of politicians 50 years ago.
Yeah, nor is the computer competency of politicians very high.
I'd wait till that one's improved.
I have two questions. Do you think possibly a lack of discovery now when others could be due to a lack of capacity to achieve? So we choose a problem without capacity to have a good motivation.
Sorry, so lack of discovery of
could be linked to maybe certain fields with they suppose have limited imagination. Based on how it's society now what's there.
I'm sorry.
I'll say so. I suppose, do you think now that perhaps our reason, the problem for our lack of discoveries per capita could be due to maybe certain societal change which I suppose have meant that now humans are less imaginative?
Sorry. Are humans less imaginative? Does television dumb us down? Is the education system now more comprehensive and therefore prevents people thinking more widely? I don't see any evidence one way or another. In fact, I don't see any evidence that explains why we're discovering less now than we did 100 years ago. I see many theories. So there's the theory that we've discovered everything. That isn't expressed as bluntly as that, but a lot of the discussion of this comes down to that. Another theory is that today there are no frontiers. So everything is, the world is enclosed, there are no more frontiers. So when somebody wanted to make creative movies in 1906, if you wanted to innovate in the movie industry, what you did, if you lived in New York and you were trying to make movies, and you didn't pay for the intellectual property of the people who owned the copyright, the patents or the cameras, they would come along. The enforcers of the Movie Patent Association would come along and smash your cameras and destroy your sets and destroy you. Now that was in 1906. What they did was, and this was this was the New Jersey, basically the mafia, from New Jersey coming along and destroying filmmaking based on the lawyers sitting in New York. What they did is they all went over this distant area where the laws couldn't be enforced, which is called Hollywood. And that's where Hollywood came from. Hollywood was the frontier that couldn't be controlled. And they introduced two innovations. One, the feature-length movie, and two, the idea of creating popular figures, the star system. So those two innovations came out, and then those were able to overwhelm the East Coast and destroy the East Coast movie industry that's never recovered. But that's yes, there are definitely social changes that could be considered, but I haven't seen any evidence. I haven't seen anybody who's done a qualitative study on the reasons that innovation is declining recovery.
So I feel like that to me, the main reason for change is the lack of motivation. The second question, I suppose, with regard to longevity, I feel like that it can also massively revolutionise the advance of science and technology. Because I don't know how it would be if we were to have an Einstein living for 1,000 years, working 1,000 years with a body that's similar to a human now in the 20s or 30s.
Okay, so Einstein did a lot of great work in his early years.
Can we just 1 second? Can we refrain from dialogue, and so we have enough time for questions for everybody?
Okay, so Einstein, I'm not an expert on Einstein by any means. I only have a random bunch of facts I know about it. I know that the last 10 or 20 years of his life, he was tackling with his single view of everything, and he didn't make any progress with that. Okay. I will withdraw that statement based on my ignorance. I will confess my ignorance, but I'm just wondering, would it be appropriate now to go into? Do you want to set up the?
We can set up the panel. I think we have one more question.
If you could just recap, by what measure do you come to the conclusion that innovation is declining? I didn't pick it up.
Okay.
But I'm interested to know what the measure is.
Okay, there are several different measures. So if you look at the number of novel patents per head of population, there are a few of them. Let's see if I can. I'll dig out the reference for you. I've got the reference. I've got a reference. I've seen 3 or 4 studies referred to that point to this.
I saw a reference once that was a claim that mathematically there's more types of protein structures possible than the number of particles in the known universe in theory. Does this mean that innovation in protein design could be unlimited effectively for a series of right. As soon as you get into areas where we could potentially develop new knowledge, it suddenly opens out. It's very large. It's you can use two models. You can use the expanding circle, or you could use the complex brain, or you could use other things. But the idea is that at the surface, we've always got lots and lots of other things that connect to that. That's intuitively what I believe, but I don't know if that's got any factual basis behind it. It's sort of a little bit like theories of the universe. It's there are lots of reasons to think about things, and I find it intuitively difficult to think that we're only going to need 13 or what was it, 8 computers. IBM determined there was only a need for 8 computers in the world in 1952.
I think it was 4.
Or 4.
And that was the president when he was estimating the potential of the market at the time. It was probably a valid assessment for the next 10 years, which I suspect is the only time period that's actually relevant for a country president.
Yeah.
I went to Davos once, and I saw the average CEO of a billion-dollar company and above is 3 years. They're only in power about 2 years, which surprised me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a reason. There's a structural reason for that. This is something I do know about, which is that basically CEOs are brought in to do a job, and by the time they've finished doing their job, they've worn themselves out. And so, particularly if you look at the leader of a bank, you take somebody at 52, the CEO of a large European multinational is put in at 52 years old. They're there to do a job. Doesn't matter how many people they impact negatively, because at the end of their 2 or 3 year term, they're going to have so much money they'll never ever possibly need to work again. And then at the end of that point, a new person is put in. It's a reasonably calamitous. Adam, do you want me to keep on with questions, or do you want to go to the panel?
Yeah, we're going to get the panel on, so but keep on with the questions until I come in.
Right. Okay, one there.
Right. It seems that there are 105 civil forces that can perhaps stifle innovation in a particular direction. But one may argue that the reason these forces exist is because we need some sort of guiding force for innovation. At the moment, a lot of engineers are in a position where they can crack open their choices and change the job. What allies, as far as, and the engineering reason only extends so far, like we can build things, we can build as well, but we don't have to build the right thing or not. So what would you suggest is a guideline for building the right thing, the nuclear bomb, a good idea or a bad one, might start with war, so what would you think?
Yep, okay. This really depends on your view of which reasons are valid and which reasons aren't valid. So when I said that I put together a list of 105, and that's not a complete, that's not, my guess is that's 2/3 of the number that would fit into that sort of category of the total list. Depending on what you think, which of those causes you subscribe to, that will impact your approach. So if you believe that the reason that good technologies aren't adopted is because the people who the technologies are designed for are too stupid to appreciate them, then which is one of the views, and I have a reputable source for explaining that the reason Indigenous Australians destroy their houses when they're built for them is because they can't appreciate, they're not civilised enough to appreciate that they need to live in a house in a particular way. And that suddenly gets into a very, very murky ethical space. But if you had that view, then you would have a view. Then you could develop a view that a totalitarian society where you give them what you produce and that's it, and nobody has any say, is the best solution for technology innovation and for the future of society. If you have a more humanistic view or a more holistic view of the world, and you think there are a whole lot of forces that are connected together, that are all influencing this stuff, then you're going to have a more complex and nuanced view of what needs to be done about it. In terms of allies, I think the question of allies for engineers is extremely important. I think engineers need to understand right from usability, multidisciplinary approach to development. Usability, we should not test ourselves as typical users when we're designing something. Through to social forces, we should align with, say, organisations that are interested in expanding the use of technology in underdeveloped areas or for critical health requirements. They are very important allies for engineers. And even understanding the limitations of our thinking. So if you go to are people familiar with the concept of appropriate technology? Okay. The idea of appropriate technology is the idea that the technology that needs to be implemented in a particular circumstance is not necessarily the latest cutting-edge technology. So a $50 device or a $5 device or a 50-cent device may be the answer to a community's need for water, not a $500 million hydro dam system. But some engineers get very worked up about that concept and believe that there is only one correct technology for a single question, and that the cutting-edge technology or the best practice technology will always be the answer regardless of whether you're sitting in Melbourne or sitting in Central Australia or sitting in another country. So getting alliances and understanding our own limitations, I think, are the two very important things. And sorry, one more.
In your opinion, is the real reason of intellectual property laws censorship rather than the encouragement of innovation?
Okay, so there are many theories of innovation. There's an interesting debate amongst economists on innovation. So if you look at the work of, say, Schumpeter in the 1930s, who developed the idea of creative destruction, which is a very, very important concept in terms of economic cycles. His view was that large corporations, very, very large corporations, enhanced innovation more than small companies because the investment you needed for innovation could only be achieved by the resources that a large organisation could amass. Michael Porter, looking at the same question and looking at the data over the last 50 years, this was about 1995, came to an opposite conclusion, which is that large corporations may have massive resources, but they have very little motivation to innovate because everything's fine. And you get things like patent trolling and people who will take out patents just so that if something happens in that space, they've got bargaining chips. Nothing about innovation. So they might do lots of research, but the research is nothing. For me, the question of encouraging more innovation, I don't think the main barrier is encouraging more innovation, because I think at the moment, and this is just a personal view, I think at the moment we have a massive amount of technology which could do massive good right at the moment if it was applied. Now, I'm not saying that's more important than innovation, but just for myself, my feeling is the quick win, and the question that came up was, what are the quickest wins we could get? The quickest wins would be just solving the problems that we've already solved. Applying the technology we've already got sitting there waiting to go. Do you want to?
Yes, that's fine. We're going to start the panel now. And,
so the questions will continue in the panel.